All right, we'd like to go ahead and start back so we can stay on schedule. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next guest, Dr. Cameron Wesson from Lehigh University, who's going to talk about early Creek resistance to globalization.
Stone Go. Thank you so much for the hospitality that's been extended to us while we've been here. I don't think we've ever been treated better collectively or individually. Am I too loud or are we okay? I come from a long line of Pentecostal ministers, so I'll be yelling at you in a second. And that's not a joke. But thank you from the bottom of our heart. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be able to share our research and the opportunity to learn and make ourselves open to the knowledge that you have and you would like for us to respond to with our professional skills. Because we're very limited, as you've sort of seen, in what it is that we can say about any aspect of your past. And I think you, as the living manifestation of that tradition, can bring the life to it that we so desperately need to make the ancient pots come alive. The second thing I need to say is, no, I am not the reincarnation of Vladimir Lenin. This is a stage that all bald white men go through, and old white men all look alike anyway. There's an advantage to going on the second day because you've sort of seen the questions that people have brought from the audience and you've seen the other presentations. There's also a limitation in the sense that so much of what we want to say has already been discussed. And so aspects of globalization have already been addressed in just about every paper that's been presented and all the discussion. What I want to do is sort of reframe from the origins what it is we're talking about when we talk about globalization. It's a fad that's sweeping university campuses right now. Every university is starting a new program in global studies, but it's ill-defined. It's the kind of thing that you see in the newspaper, and we think we know what it means, but I want to go back to the origins of what brought my ancestors to Talladega County, Alabama in 1832, and what forces took your ancestors out of Talladega County, Alabama in 1832. So we'll go on that journey together. First and foremost, when we talk about globalization, we are talking about the forces that have been at work pan-globally for the last 500 years or so that have brought people, things, and knowledge across the globe. Half of you right now are probably tuning me out so that you can check a sports score or email or Twitter or something else. That's a manifestation of globalization. The idea that we can communicate with friends and family and loved ones and exchange information in an instant anywhere in the world. That we can take satellite uplink trucks into the middle of the Amazon so that the Brazilian nation can show World Cup soccer to indigenous people. That's globalization. But it's a process just like any other because it has a human face on it that has a unique history. And that's where archaeology can really help because many of those connections exist outside the documentary record of globalization, and archaeologists can look at the material manifestations that brought those things to be. Most of the time when we think about globalization in the modern context, and I like to use modern examples because it helps to drive the points home. So when I teach with my students, I like to sort of time shift because I don't see time as separated in the past and the present. I think many of the Indian people here can probably agree there's a continuity. The past is always manifested in the present. So when we talk about globalization, one of the things that the forces of business talk about is global opportunity. That we want to put a McDonald's or a Starbucks on every street corner everywhere in the globe. And that's a good thing if you own stock in McDonald's perhaps, or a mutual fund or 401k, something that's going to put money in your pocket. But is it a good thing? Is exporting McDonald's as the symbol of American global economics, and this is pretty much it. When the world thinks of the United States, they think about Coca-Cola, they think about Ronald McDonald, and they think about drones dropping bombs from the sky. So there's some commentary, there's some feedback. Globalization is not always a positive thing, and I think the fact that we're here today talking about it should drive some of those points home. In fact, over the last 20, 25 years, scholars have really started to return to the basic narratives of nation-state building in North America and getting over a lot of those tired traditional stories that have been told in history classes and on Columbus Day parades and Thanksgivings that Indian people have rejected a long time ago. And we're a little slow, we're anthropologists, we'll eventually get there. But the basic idea now is that we're trying to understand not just the side of globalization that puts money in your pocket, that makes entrepreneurial opportunities possible, but its impacts on individual people. I'm first and foremost an anthropologist. I choose to practice anthropology as an archaeologist, looking at the past and the material remains to understand the human present. So this connection between you and your traditions and what I want to study archaeologically are hand in hand. And it's a story of globalization, because the Creek people are among the first in human history to face nascent globalization. It's something that makes the news a lot today, but your ancestors were the first that really had to face some of these forces, these international global developments. And social scientists are fantastic at generating models for how the world works. This is a famous model. It's a form of dependency theory Emanuel Wallerstein came up with, and it's a way of modeling why it is that Europe needed to come to the Americas, and why it is that they needed the natural resources and the labor power that Native peoples provided. And so it's a very simple model, but it's a very self-serving model. It's a very Eurocentric model, because what it argues is that the world is divided up into core nations, peripheral nations, and semi-peripheral nations or regions. And that the core nations are always looking to maximize their profit, minimize expenses, right? All the business jargon that you can see in the Wall Street Journal or in CNN. And so what they always want to do is go out and find resources on the cheap, labor on the cheap, and then use that to their advantage to make a profit. And so core nations, and in this case we're going to talk about England, France, and other European nations, thought it a great idea to find and exploit resources that were available in the Americas, take those and ship them back, transform them into finished goods, and then feed their economy based on that. If you have an iPhone here, where are those iPhones made? China, right? Probably most of your Samsung Galaxy phones as well. They're made in China for a reason, because we can get people to work and to provide resources and to spoil their environment because they don't have the EPA legislation that we do here. And so this is a story that's pretty old. This isn't a brand new story, but it's also one that leaves a lot out. Where are the people in this story? This is a story about nations, about commodities, about large scales, a macro scale, like looking at the Earth from outer space. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world of social relationships between you and I and other people, family, friends. And so that's the story that archaeologists want to get beyond the model and get to the story of people. So why North America? Why the Southeast? Why Europeans came to the region is basically because a series of geopolitical instabilities started to choke them off from the trade resources that they needed. The rise of the Islamic Caliphate across the Middle East choked off the Silk Road. All sorts of issues between East and West. Europe is a little appendage here. Historically, for the vast majority of its occupation, it's been an afterthought in global history. It's only the last 500 years, because of globalization, that it was able to sort of transcend that. And so all of these are trade networks that archaeologists and historians have linked, bringing materials both to Europe and out of Europe. And there are several choke points when it gets to the Mediterranean. And so what happens is, if the places where you're importing these goods, particularly spices, exotic materials, silks, if those get shut off, what happens to the price of those commodities in Europe? They go sky high. Hyperinflation, economic instability. The same sort of issues that we're talking about today when we talk about the government shutdown, when we talk about import-export relationships. And this is really what starts that. And so what's one of the ways that we can address that today? If the price of a commodity goes up, how do we respond to that? Well, we can stop buying it, right? We can just vote with our dollars and say, well, we're not going to participate. The other thing that we can do is try and find another source. If it's too expensive at store A, we're going to take our consumer power and go to store B. And so what Europe decides to do is to cut out the middlemen. because every one of these trade entreports, when stuff's offloaded or unloaded onto a boat, onto a camel's back as it's making its journey across these regions, guess what? Somebody gets a cut. So by the time those materials reach its final destination, you've paid for it 6 times over. So somebody has the bright idea that if we make our own ships and we go and get this stuff directly from the people who manufacture it, we can cut out all of the middlemen. We can cut our production costs, we can maximize profits. It's basic economics 101. And so that's sort of a primer as to the original idea. Now you hear all sorts of very self-serving, Western-centric ideas about discovery, right? That we got in ships, Europeans got in ships to go to places because we wanted to prove that the Earth was round. Most of the educated people of Europe, the mathematicians, cosmologists, people had already understood that for more than a century. So it didn't have anything to do with a scientific expedition. What it had to do with finding these market sources, cutting out middlemen in the process. And so Western European nations go on this ever-expanding idea of finding the best source of these materials that they need to trade for. And North America just happens to become one of those because of its resource base, which Barney and other people have already talked about. And so we've seen a lot of Lemoyne's depictions and engravings here, but they're really excellent. Some of the historical veracity of them has been called into question. There's certainly a license here with the European conventions on art, but basically what happens when Europeans show up is that we demonstrate the principle of the house guest that never left. I don't know how many of you have had a cousin or a friend or somebody who's down on their luck who decides they're going to couch surf with you for a day or two at most. 6 months later, when they're still picking up their mail in your mailbox and watching your television and eating out of your refrigerator, it can get a little annoying. 500 years later, when they're still on your couch eating out of your refrigerator, it's more than just a little annoying. And so this is really what happens. I mean, it's the story of the neighborhood goes bad when Europeans show up. But we love our models. We love our stories. We love our fictions. And largely because it's people that look like me, who've written about Native American histories, who've told the story of the European presence here, we've tended to put our thumb on the scale to really magnify one aspect of those relationships, and that is to really honor our ancestors. What great, marvelous people they were. And it is not such a great story to tell little kids in the 3rd grade when they start learning about American history or singing songs or whatever, that we came here because we were economic entrepreneurs. We got to find a better story than that. And so the story that we traditionally tell is that Europeans, by droves, came here yearning for religious freedom. Right? Portrait art like this is fantastic. They're pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. They're going to drop to a knee, thank the divine. We've got a woman who's swooned over here because she's so overtaken. That didn't happen, right? No. This is what happened. Before the Pilgrims, before this idea of American occupation of Europeans for religious freedom, entrepreneurs. A historian has actually called this period adventure capitalism, right, as a pun for venture capitalism. It was the idea that European financiers who wanted to make more money doing importing and exporting outfitted ships and companies, got charters from their local king or queen, and set up commercial establishments to facilitate this sort of trade. They sent people here to spy out the coast and see what resources there were that they could extract and use to transform their economies back at home. And it's absolutely no wonder that England in particular uses the resources of the eastern seaboard of North America to transform itself into the greatest global economic power of the period. This is when the empire gets started. So the kind of stories that we tell don't even get Thanksgiving right. Who's being served and who's doing the serving? I mean, the absolute audacity that this is the kind of stuff that we've talked about, that we've portrayed, that we presented to children as sort of, it's got to be true, it's in my high school textbook or junior high textbook, or there's a painting of it at a local history museum. We've gotten the story wrong at just about every single level because it's a self-serving story, right? And part of that is because we want to believe, as Reagan said, we're a bright and shining city on a hill. American exceptionalism. That we are e pluribus unum, out of many one. That we are the New Jerusalem in many respects. And that national narrative is very much a narrative told by Caucasian people, about Caucasian people, that marginalizes other sorts of stories. Why I love archaeology, why I was drawn to archaeology, is that archaeology has been called very recently by some very progressive political, now you'll think I look like Lenin, by some very progressive thinkers, that it's an emancipatory discipline. Archaeology doesn't have to just tell stories about great dead white ancestors. Anthropology is a toolkit. It's a way of seeing the world that empowers people to tell the stories that are important to them. And again, that's why I'm honored to be here, because I hope we can start a continuing dialogue that will help me ask better questions and answer questions that you have, but maybe don't have the access to the toolkit to get to. So, what can archaeology do? Our sister discipline, our parent discipline, cultural anthropology, has been at work for a long period of time, working with indigenous peoples to address pressing matters today related to globalization. So this is a meeting of indigenous peoples in Brazil in 2009 that was largely funded and brought about by anthropologists on a global network who are trying to get indigenous people to demand of their governments the kind of rights, responsibilities, and protections for their landscape, their traditional cultural knowledge, and their traditional cultural places. And so nobody's going to give that to you, as you very well know. Anything that you get from governments, you have to demand. And that's exactly what's happening here. So again, I'll return to this idea of models. We love to model the world, right? Linear equations, all these sorts of things that you're taught in school. Models are great to a certain extent, because what models do is they help you understand the world by removing a lot of the variables that actually work in the real world and simplifying it down to just a few that you can maybe quantify, count, weigh, measure, and put into an equation. Here's the problem with models. There's supposed to be this is a model too. A model of what? A model of a female. This is the actual woman on the left. She's been remodeled. She's not pretty enough. She's not virtuous enough. She doesn't have the right features that we're looking for to represent our cosmetics company or our teeth whitening company, whatever it is we're trying to sell. So we've got to go in and digitally Photoshop her to make her more beautiful than she was before. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with her in the raw, in the natural state. But we find fault with that. And I want to just use that as sort of a visual pun, because that's the problem with any model we ever use in archaeology or the other social sciences, is that it is always an approximation of the reality. And it's always told from a certain perspective to answer a certain question that may not be the question that's the most pressing or the most important. So, again, with archaeology, this is why I'm driven to do archaeology, because it can actually produce data that challenge the status quo, that can be of service to local communities who have questions about their past or about other people's past, but it doesn't discriminate. The archaeological record produces the data that then we analyze and put into our own frameworks, theoretical models, and other sorts of things. But we constantly have to be challenged to hold our models up to reality, to see if we're airbrushing away the truth from the past as well. So we've heard a lot of discussion over the last couple of days about the Mississippian Southeast and the impressive earthen mounds and large communities that the eastern woodlands hosted, developed, that your ancestors were a central part of establishing. And what happens to these societies? Why did the scale of development that they exemplified between, say, 1000 AD and 1500 suddenly come to an end roughly around the time period of massive influx of European ideas, people, diseases, other sorts of things? Well, we've already had it addressed. I'll just reinforce it very briefly. One of the major things that happens is that Europeans bring diseases that native peoples don't have previous exposure to. So without natural antibodies passed from mother to child, you're more susceptible. And those diseases that Europeans have, that they get sick from, but they recover because they've got these antibodies, become deadly pathogens. This is a very sort of typical scene. This is from the Codex Florentine, recorded in the 15th century. The great backstory here is this is recorded by a Spanish friar, Sahagún, and this occurs 40 years after the Spanish have decided that the Mexica, what we call the Aztec today, were worshiping the devil before they brought the Catholic Church to them, and so they burned all of their sacred books. These were literate people who had texts, libraries. And one of the first things they did was, we got to destroy all that knowledge. So they destroyed that knowledge to make a break between the traditions of the past and those of the future, those that they wanted to inculcate in local people. And somewhere along the line, before the last people who lived through that cultural exchange passed away, Sahagún got the idea that it'd be great to have them record once again what their lives were like before the Europeans came. And so they go through and record a whole series of different vignettes, different drawings that address the daily life of the Aztec people. So someone asked last night, and it was a wonderful question, we're talking about political societies, population movements, all these other things. What was daily life like for the people? I love that question. That's fantastic. And it's one that we can only get tantalizing glimpses at in the archaeological record, but it's one that we always need to strive for. And so this is part of that story. Dobbins, Ramanovsky, other epidemiologists, archaeologists who've studied this process, suggest that the demographic collapse, in terms of sheer number of native souls in North America, was reduced by about 90%, rather. So if you think about that as sort of the American genocide, and this isn't an intentional genocide, this isn't people being put into ovens like in World War II, but this is the idea that these pathogens are so viral, so virulent, that they're actually destroying native populations. And so this led a lot of archaeologists to say no society can sustain that kind of demographic decline without losing essential parts of who and what it is. This led an archaeologist in 1987 to actually pen, and I'll paraphrase, a line that basically said, the diseases were so impactful in native societies that it forever severs living native peoples from their pre-European ancestors. Well, if you want to believe that, you act as though that's true. And so the research that you do in an archaeological setting sets out to prove that that's the case. And in fact, I think what everybody who's presented over the last 2 days has tried to argue is that's complete BS. You're living proof of those continuities. The archaeological record is proof of those continuities. And that's where we are today. We're dismissing many of those old models, those old expectations, that you can go through the Holocaust and still maintain your identity. You can go through the Holocaust and still tell your children and your grandchildren and ensure that those stories become part of who and what you are, that sacred cultural knowledge is continually passed from generation to generation. And as Barney pointed out, it doesn't mean that society doesn't change, but what it does mean is that it's not this complete, as Mitt Romney's campaign manager said after the Republican nomination process, that we're just going to wipe the etch sets clean and start all over. Indian people didn't do that, and it's fantastic that they didn't. The other thing that has been invoked as a model for change for Native people has been the introduction of European trade goods. So as early as 1928, archaeologists were arguing that the things that Europeans brought to the shores of North America were so enticing, were so seductive, that Native peoples immediately dropped what they were doing and ran to the local trade house to get anything that they possibly could get from Europeans, because it was cool. Now, the archaeological record of the last 40 years doesn't support that at all. In fact, what it supports is the idea that Indian traders, people who went to these trade houses and engaged in these exchanges, were savvy consumers. Again, as Barney pointed out, they struck the terms of trade. And I'll talk a bit in a moment about the playoff system, where the idea was as long as you have multiple stores, you've got the French, you've got the Spanish, you've got the British, you play them against each other, you're in the catbird seat, right? That's like 3 used car dealers in your town all trying to sell you a 1997 Camaro. And you've got money in your hand and you're ready to buy. You are in the catbird seat. You just go from one to the other and tell them what the other one was willing to sell it for until you eventually get the price that you want. So this idea that this is a unidirectional thing, that Europeans do something and Native Americans respond, we're beyond that. That's not where we are. So a whole series of archaeologists, and hopefully she's on the docket to be able to come at your next symposium. Robbie Etheridge at the University of Mississippi has done an excellent, excellent job of advancing sort of ethnohistorical and archaeological approaches to these perspectives, looking at continuities, also looking at change. And what she's focused on, and people that she's gathered together in sort of a long-term research group, are looking at the impacts on Mississippian societies and Indian peoples when Europeans show up. And many of those show up and affect communities prior to ever contacting a European. These diseases, as we learned yesterday, are being traded between Indian peoples without a European face. One person gets it, and it doesn't matter where those diseases originated. You just cough on somebody else, and they cough on somebody else, and it just goes from community to community. And that this process created a shatter zone. Now, that's been questioned, right? Again, we're going to go back to that. Because what a lot of these scholars argue is for what they call the billiard ball model, that Europeans show up in one place and establish a colony, and it influences the local Indian peoples who then try to move. And your moves are somewhat limited because you're bumping into lands that are owned or occupied by other people. And so this sort of, when you strike the cue ball and it hits all the others, they just go in different directions. And this is sort of a model that's been applied. I love Robbie's work, but here's what I propose. And this is mine. I'm going to trademark this. I call it the saltwater taffy model. Anybody here know what saltwater taffy is? Ever had it? Ever eat saltwater taffy when you have braces or dental work? Somebody tell me what's that like. It's a chore. Cultures are not billiard balls. They're not solidified objects that have firm boundaries. Cultures are living things. It's like plant communities that we talked about earlier. The idea that exposure to other plants, changes in environment, change the genetic nature of those plants is basically the same for human cultures. Exposure to new ideas, exposure to other people, where you're getting your marriage partners, which other communities you're engaging in stomp dances with. All of these things are vectors that bring change into society, and change is the only constant. But what happens is that some of those ideas stick. And so these boundaries that we like to draw on maps that show, well, this is where the Muskogee people were, and this is where the Yuchi were, and this is where the Shawnee were. I mean, in many cases, those are one snapshot in time, because we know that people moved, that people weren't tied to landscapes in perpetuity, but that there's a push and a pull. And there's also a push and a pull in identity. I've met so many of you over the last 2 days who are Muskogee Creek, but who have marriage partners or children who have married people from other Indian nations. And this idea about, that doesn't make you non-Indian, right? That doesn't make you non-Muskogee. It makes you multiple things, right? We have multiple forms of identity. And so the same sort of thing goes on with the saltwater taffy model, is that I'm not forcing you to be one thing or the other. I'm allowing this process to have certain experiences and ideas and things that stick, that are long-lasting. And so to finally get to the archaeology, because everybody else has stepped on every line I wanted to tell you, I work in central Alabama, which is literally where I grew up. So for me, this is walking out your backyard as a 5 or 6-year-old kid and finding Native American pottery at the last manifestation of the Coosa site, which Marvin Smith talked about yesterday. Literally grew up in a subdivision called Indian Hills on the Childersburg archaeological site, which is a travesty in and of itself. But let's just say the respect and affinity that I have for indigenous people, particularly for the Creek, is what got me started in archaeology. And so working at a series of archaeological sites pioneered by Greg Wasselkov and some of his colleagues led me to a long-term interest in exactly the woman's question last night, which is, what was daily life like for people after these damn Europeans show up and never leave? And so looking at that process, we see that this is an area that had these Mississippian chiefdoms, these multi-community, politically highly structured organizations. Archaeology prior to European arrival shows that the Tallapoosa River Valley in central Alabama is sort of betwixt and between some of these larger political entities. But that after European contact, lots and lots of things change. And so my first undergraduate degree, I didn't think I'd ever get a job in archaeology, to tell you the truth, so I decided to be an architect. So I got a degree in architecture and hated it. And I thought, I'll go do archaeology, and I can't hate that. Who could ever hate that? And so I took my experience as an architecture major and as an architect into my study of archaeology, which is looking at households, looking at domestic structures and the social relationships between the people who occupied them, trying to look at how your daily life changes over the period of 300 years. And it's a story that very much, as Barney and other people have talked about, involves foodways, both plant and animal. It involves geopolitics. It involves globalization. But first and foremost, as somebody pointed out last night, and it was a brilliant comment, it's not a colonialist narrative. It's not an idea that all of these changes originate with Europeans. Europeans do something and Native Americans respond. again, that's not where we are in contemporary archaeology. The idea is that indigenous people vote with their feet, they vote with their voices, they made strategic choices to survive. And just like other indigenous people globally now facing these same sort of global forces, they make choices on a daily basis about what they're going to maintain, how it's going to be passed to future generations, what they're going to value, and where the line in the sand is that they're going to say, nope, not one more inch. We're willing to kill or die for what's ours. And so by talking about houses, and this is actually something when I was an undergraduate student, Dr. Foster and Dr. King's undergraduate advisor at Georgia, Dave Holly, wrote something in 1974 that influenced me tremendously. And what he said is, if we think we're going to understand the Creek Confederacy, the Muskogee Nation, in the past as an entity, it's not going to happen. But what we can do is we can understand individual towns, individual grounds, and individual houses. And it was the most transformative experience, because too often we want to talk about whole communities, whole towns. We want to talk about those sort of ultra organizations at a macro scale. But really, they're composed of individual families, extended families, clans, moieties, all the same sorts of kinship structures that you recognize today in your community. And so by talking about houses, we then can eventually build to talking about communities. And then maybe sometime for my grandchildren, we'll be talking about things like political confederacies. And so the archaeological research that I've been a part of, and I'm going to butcher it, this is, this is so hard. For 25 years, we've called it Kusahatchee. And all it took was getting on an airplane and coming to Okmulgee to learn that that's not the proper word. How do we pronounce it? Kusahatchee. How stupid. Right? Stupid white guy yet again. Falls for it every time. So this is an aerial photograph of an archaeological site that's one of those historic towns on the Tallapoosa River. And our excavations were initially started by Greg Wazelkov to try and relocate all of the named towns that show up in the historic documents in the Tallapoosa River Valley, and he and his cohort did a fantastic job. And in the process of identifying these sites, what we discovered is the biggest moneymaker for local farmers in central Alabama is not probably growing pot, but we won't talk about that. The biggest moneymaker for these farmers is not anything that they can grow, but it's the gravel beneath the soil. So industrial gravel extraction, where in a 1 acre area you can often have $2 million worth of construction grade gravel, drives the destruction of many creek sites. So what you see here is us doing what's called I've forgotten the term, salvage, thank you. It's salvage archaeology. We are literally on a transect, and out there in the distance is about a 3-ton belly scraper that takes 8 inches of soil with every stripe, and we're running out trying to map and record individual houses and pits as we go. And so this is the idea that if we don't gather this information using the skill set that we have, it's going to end up in a roadbed somewhere. It's going to be destroyed forever. And so there was a sense of urgency that drove this project, and we were there for 12 years. And so what we ended up doing was basically excavating about 75% of the entire town. And this is not the entire village plan, but it's the downtown section that we were able to recover. And it has a series of both public and private domestic structures. And what interests me are primarily the domestic structures. And we've got a series of semi-subterranean, circular, or octagonal structures that we were hearing described yesterday. And we also have a series of sort of rectangular summer houses. So these fit the traditional definition of summer and winter houses, that it gets too hot in the summer to stay inside for sort of these very thick, well-insulated walls. So you go outside to a more lightly built structure. And then in the winter months, you go into a somewhat sunken floored house that maintains all the thermal properties of embanked earth structure. And it's basically a much better environment to stay in. Well, what happens at this site is that by the 19th century, by 1800, we're starting to see people moving away from downtown. And I'll sort of recall some of the issues that Barney talked about in her talk, is we start to see the later houses are built on the periphery of the community, and the center of town is starting to be abandoned. That's a mystery. Why do people move away from towns? Because the center of Creek towns has always been where life was, right? That's where the community festivals occurred. That's where all the daily life you wanted to be downtown because that's where your social relationships and political relationships were manifest. So moving away from downtown poses a bit of a problem. So looking at these structures, not just in terms of their architectural sizes and shapes, but the kind of behavior that went on inside, and this is probably a good analog. This is from Massachusetts, from Plymouth Plantation, a reconstructed interior. So trying to go from the post holes and the fire hearths that we found in the middle of these houses to putting flesh back on the people and sort of redecorating the interior of these houses and reconstructing what daily life was like has been what's fascinated me for more than 20 years. The first thing that pops out to me, and here we sort of break these into archaeologically identifiable time periods. So we have archaeological time that we've divided up. One's called the Atassi phase and the other the Tallapoosa. The Atassi phase is roughly 1600 to 1715. And the Tallapoosa phase is roughly 1715 until about 1810, 1812. And so what we start to see is houses get dramatically smaller. And when we do statistical size tests, what we recognize is that the later houses get smaller. Well, I guess that would fit if we're talking about demographic decline. If we're talking about fewer people because of European diseases, you don't need as much area in your houses. The only problem is when we look, and again, these are not unbiased sources, but when we look at Spanish and English censuses, we were spying on your ancestors, right? Not just the NSA reading your emails today or your text messages. We did that in the past. We sent traders and military people into your communities with the idea that they were going to write that up and send it to somebody back at the colonial headquarters and say, how many gunmen are there in Hotlawali in case we have to go to war with them? How many men, women, and children are there in these communities? And so they record these informal censuses to try and basically get military information so that they can spy. I mean, for better or worse. And so what they argue is that the Tallapoosa River towns are actually increasing in population. You're getting more people coming in and more diverse people. One of the hallmarks of the Muskogee people has been your generosity, not just to us, but historically. The Muskogee Creek Confederacy had wide open arms that allowed other people to come in, to be accepted into the communities who spoke different languages, who had different traditions, different ways of life, were all welcomed. And it's one of the things that allowed, as an adaptive strategy to globalization, that allowed you to withstand a lot of the really most negative and impactful forces of globalization for an incredibly long period of time. So, interesting, the houses are getting smaller, but the villages have more people. And so what that probably means is some of the social relationships that you have with extended family members are starting to change as a result of these impacts. What we also start to find is that you're storing more food in your houses. So when we look at subterranean storage pits, and these, before refrigeration, it's the primary place where people were going to store their food that they wanted to eat into the future. You dig a hole in the corner, you sort of seal pots and other things and put a meal away for the future. We don't see in the early period a whole lot of that interior household-based storage. Now, maybe they were storing it in a way that doesn't show up archaeologically. That's a very good point. But what we do see is just a hypertrophy. Lots and lots of in-house storage, particularly for maize, where people are storing this stuff up in large numbers. Now, generally, and this isn't using ethnohistory from the Creek people, but from South American native peoples, there's an argument that says you only put food in the ground in large amounts when you haven't previously done that for two reasons. One is that you fear confiscation, that somebody's going to come and take it. Or two, you don't want your neighbors to know exactly how much you have at your disposal, so when they need some, they won't come and ask for it. Right? It's like, nope, don't have any extra corn. You have to go ask somebody else. And so you're reserving these things for your own survival. Right? Survival instinct kicks in. And normally when we talk about human communities, we start, as things get tougher and tougher and tougher, we tend to favor people that are in our immediate families, that have close genetic relationships and social relationships to us. And so it makes sense that for your children, your nieces, your grandmother, those are the people that you want to hold that food back. And if it means that a cousin maybe doesn't get a cut, well, that cousin will have to do something somewhere else. And so these kind of pressures appear to be showing up in household storage. And again, to draw on Barney's point earlier, we start to see things in the archaeological record that we never would have seen in previous periods. This is from Fushachi. This is a fawn. This is a baby deer. It's been killed, and its lower limbs have been removed because that's where most of the choice meat is going to be, even on a baby. As part of the archaeological record. And here's our scale. This is tiny. I mean, this is like the size of a small dog. This is not a very old animal. processing marks and everything that we were able to identify while in the field, I don't know if Barney's ever even seen this photo, are that this animal was predated. This is something that somebody hunted or killed and brought back and ate. That doesn't support what Gail and other people were talking about in terms of sustainability, right? This isn't something that a Creek hunter would have ever been proud of. Why would you kill a baby deer? Because you've got babies at home that are hungry, that need to be fed. This is the only resource that's available. And these are the kind of choices that people have to make when confronted with these global issues. So this is how that same Lemoyne idea about how we're going to hunt. We're going to hunt for males. We're going to hunt for the strongest. We're not going to do anything that's going to undermine herd survivability. We want it to sustain us, not just for today, but for the future. And so some aspects of what we find at the archaeological record don't fall into those expectations. And so why would that be? Not only are there these sorts of issues about, where we're getting our food and sort of favoring close relatives in our homes, we start to see a diversity of European objects showing up in Creek houses. So on the domestic sphere, people are starting to trade in increasing numbers for European materials. Not for everything Europeans are bringing, but for the specific things that they need. And a lot of it is household durable goods. Kettles, pots, hatchets, other things that we believe are being put to productive use to help the household out. And so these are from the Cross Keys site, and this is from the Talladega site, where at a lot of these sites, the inclusion of European material goods in terms of volume starts to outweigh that of indigenous production. So we're starting to see more things that the Europeans produced and traded than things that your ancestors were making and using themselves. And part of that process is because it's good to be a consumer at certain times, right? When employment is high and inflation is low, when you've got money in your pocket, ready to spend it. And during the period when the playout system was at work, that's identified by Richard White and other people, we've got the British and then later the Americans, we've got the Spanish and we've got the French, and if we don't like the terms of trade of one, we just go to the other. Right? That's the way capitalism in a textbook format is supposed to work. And that worked very, very well for Creek peoples. Until Walmart came to town. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen the documentary, The High Price of Doing Business, the Walmart story and other things like that. Everybody loves to dish on Walmart, right? But we all shop there, so we have to have a support group for Walmart Shoppers Anonymous or something. What ends up happening is we tend to, when things are priced low and they're in relative abundance, we overindulge. There's a crazy statistic that even during the middle of this recession, Americans on average spend 104% of their income. Where do we get 104%? How can you spend 104%? We're borrowing from the equity in our homes, but primarily we're putting it on credit cards, right? We're financing tomorrow, or forget about tomorrow, we're financing today with money that we think we may earn in the future. And that's sort of endemic to the capitalist system. It wants you to consume and consume and consume. And then Walmart's got you. Because what happened to the bicycle shop that used to be in downtown Okmulgee once Walmart's selling bicycles for half what they sold them for? Bye-bye bicycle shop. My dad was a small-town pharmacist. What happens when CVS comes to town? Sorry, you're out of business. You can't compete with the price levels. But then, once all those businesses are out, what pressure is there for Walmart to sell bikes at 50% off? It's called predatory pricing. You put everybody else out of business. And ultimately, in the sort of game that Professor Wasselkopf will be talking about here after lunch, what ends up happening is the geopolitics play out between European powers to the point that eventually you're left with the United States, and that's about the only game in town. And the Americans were never the best trading partners for Creek peoples or other indigenous people of the Southeast. What they used was trade was a leverage to get land. Trade was an opportunity to get you indebted, to say, take it on credit. You can pay it off later. And then eventually, when later comes, the expectation of payment comes at the price of things like the Treaty of Fort Jackson, where something like 33 million acres of land are ceded, not just as war reparations, but to settle claims against Creek trader and trade partners. And so there's a whole series of archaeological and historical studies of these processes. Probably the best recent one, if you're looking for something to read that's a real page-turner that deals with not just aspects of Creek history and archaeology, but that of other southern Indians, is this by Hall. And what he does is he makes a really interesting distinction. The graciousness that you've extended to us has included gifting, right? You gave us all swag bags last night. I felt like I was at the Academy Awards. I've got a beautiful cultural preservation bag filled with all sorts of goodies. I haven't even explored them all. It's just fantastic. You gifted me. Gifting is part of Creek culture. It's part of Native American culture. It's part of most indigenous cultures worldwide. And it's something that capitalists just don't understand. It confounds them. Here's a great... I don't know how I'm doing on time. Like I said, I'm a Pentecostal minister's son, so I'll go forever. Okay, I'll hurry up. There's a great story from Virginia, where Virginia needed more skins, more deer skin trade. And so to incentivize people to produce more, they told their Native American trading partners in Virginia that if you'll bring more skins in at the end of the month, we'll pay you twice the value of the ones that we did last month, which sounds like a bargain. Right? We're going to double what we pay you for the skins that you bring in. So the next month rolls around, the traders come in from the field with their skins, and they have half as many skins as they had the month before. And the traders are pulling their hair out, saying, didn't you understand we were going to pay you double? And they said, yeah, that was a wonderful gift, because we only killed enough deer and brought enough skins for the things that we needed, and you gave us a vacation for the rest of the time. Thank you. Now, what's the capitalist mindset in that situation? If your boss promises to double your pay if you double your productivity, how hard are you going to work that next month? That mindset says work until you drop, exhaust every resource that you have to make that profit possible. Are we getting feedback? I'm sorry. I can feel it. We're going to raise the roof here in a second. So hospitality, generosity, and gifting are part of an indigenous code. They're part of a Native American relationship building that's about individuals, not necessarily about nation states. It's about being hospitable to somebody in a time of need, extending friendship. With a capitalist, it's about profit. It's about exploitation. And so I'm painting with very broad terms, I know, but basically what ends up happening, because of misunderstandings about the nature of gifting and trade, suddenly most trade used to go through the local MECOs. MECOs determined the terms of trade and often were the vehicle through which it was dispersed into people in the community. Well, if we don't like that anymore, we can circumvent the MECO. We can go ourselves to the local trade house and get the things that we want and exchange them. And therefore, we're starting to cut through those traditional systems of exchange, of gift giving and alliance building within our own communities. And so we get quotes like this from the 1700s that said, the old men of note have to earn great veneration from material riches, which basically means if you want followers, if you want people to support your political machine, show us the money, show us the things. We need things. You need to make things appear in trade and exchange. And so it puts accumulative pressures. It puts this idea of competitive capitalism on display, that the one that dies with the most toys apparently wins, as the bumper sticker says. And so there's this idea that indigenous people have, this is another quote from Creek MECO Mortar in 1765, which is basically a plea to their European trade partners, which says, in the past we didn't know anything about the material goods that you have, but you brought them to us, and now we've been so accustomed to them, and it's so affected our way of life, that basically they're necessary for us. That now we need them to create our own marriage alliances, family relationships, and political issues at home have to be used to settle them. And so this is Fussahatchee MECO, 1790 by John Trumbull. Some people may know John Trumbull. He also painted George Washington. One of the most famous portraits of Washington is by Trumbull. And so in 1790, he recorded the MECO of this community that we excavated. And he's dressed up in European clothing with all sorts of materials of piece metal and other sorts of things. He came in his regalia. And this demonstrates that you had to wear that regalia to show people in your community your social standing, but then you also had to be a vehicle for redistribution of those materials in your community. William Bartram, who writes about a lot of these issues as well, talks about the effects of globalization on community structure. And what we start to see, just like at Fussahatchee, and this is what we think is happening to explain that process of outmigration late in the process, is that people are starting to move away, as Barney was talking late in this period, to increase ranching. They're claiming lands for themselves. They're moving away from the Tawa. They're moving away from the town. They're starting to build fences. They're starting to build houses that look very much like a European colonial model. They're starting to move out of even many of the old towns and starting to live independently or as extended families away from the community. Now, they still have a tie with the grounds. They still identify with one of those communities. But what happens when you move away, even if it's just 5 miles or 10 miles? That distance doesn't give you the opportunity to exchange social information and to be part of the same conversation on a daily basis. And so, for exhaustion of firewood, other sorts of issues, we start to see towns start to diffuse across the landscape and individual farmsteads start to take their place. And so this is a drawing from the Chattahoochee River of a creek house. This is not any kind of architectural style that the Creeks would have been constructing earlier in this process. This is something that's very much a process or a product of this sort of interaction with Europeans. And the distancing, the idea that, again, communities are starting to become very, very diffuse. Now, this I ripped from Tom's article from Foster and Cohen in American Antiquity, looking at pollen samples, actually looking at soil cores and looking at the incidence of fires in the southeast. And I think they make an excellent argument that fires for flushing out game are starting to become more rampant, that you're starting to burn landscapes to try and flush out what remaining deer are there so that you can continue this trade process. But another interpretation is that you're also clearing land for those ranches. You're clearing land for animals that need to graze, like cattle. And that's a very intensive process, and it also is a very environmentally destructive process. And you're also following the advice of jerks like Benjamin Hawkins, right? This is Benjamin Hawkins from a famous painting, and I hate this painting more than most. And I love paintings, but this one I hate. Because here he is, showing the Creek how to grow prodigious amounts of corn. You needed that advice, right? You needed somebody from Washington who came on the orders of George Washington to come down and show you how to do that. And so it's this idea that here in the foreground, you know, you're in a state of abject poverty, and that's actually a term that's used in some of these documents, and he's going to lift you out through manual labor. By being farmers and ranchers, you're going to transform yourselves into part of that civilized American dream, which again is a very colonial white dream. And as the Cherokee learned at New Echota, it doesn't matter how many constitutions you write, how many Capitol buildings you build. When the government wants your land, it doesn't matter. You're still that's when you become an Indian, when they want the resources that you have. And so this has been explored very recently by a whole series of archaeologists that want to decolonize what we study in the past. They want to get beyond telling stories, white people telling stories about other white people. And it's a very difficult process because these are the kinds of things that you have to do sort of deep introspection on. We've been told certain stories over and over and over, and if you're told that you're smart long enough, you start to act as though you're smart. And if you're told that you're stupid, if you're told that you're stupid, you tend to act on it. My father's pet name for me when I was a kid, I don't think he meant anything by it, but we were Pentecostal, keep that in mind, was stupid idiot. And so I think, and my brother was fatso. I think I decided to become a college professor on some level to prove to my dad that I wasn't a stupid idiot, but you can probably be a better judge of that than me. So to close, you all expected Star Wars reference at some point today. Everybody knows something about Star Wars, right? Right? It's this epic battle long, long ago. But the Star Wars that I want to talk about is in a place very close in a time not so long ago. Pick your hero. Somebody tell me really quickly, who was the hero of Star Wars? That's right, Darth Vader. Trying to install galactic order on an unruly mass. No, that's wrong. Anybody who saw that and thought that Darth Vader was the hero probably needs their head examined or needs better heroes. Who was the hero? It was obviously Luke Skywalker and the Rebel Alliance. So we get to make a choice in archaeology. And I hate to put it in such stark terms, but realistically, as a profession, I think this is where we are. We get to support the old establishment. We get to continue to tell stories that pat us on the back and talk about these pioneers that come to a virgin forest and hack out a living and what a great story that was. Or we get to turn the tables and we get to use those same colonialist tools against the colonizer. And we get to tell the story of the Rebel Alliance. And it's so much more fun to be in the Rebel Alliance. It's so much more fun to tell the stories of the downtrodden and those that haven't had other people seek out their voice and the opportunity to share it. And I think that's who you are. You are the Rebel Alliance. And I want to help tell your story. Thank you.
On the fawn that was killed, whenever you have a find like that, and you could probably Japan too, how do you know it wasn't just an anomaly, an accident, maybe a child learning to hunt? I mean, do you have other finds like that that
No.
you can put in that time period?
No, in fact, at that site, that is an anomaly. That's a lone individual. And so this is an interpretive discipline. So as Eric Wolf once said, it's the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the social sciences. And so it's perplexing. It's perplexing to say exactly the cultural process and the actions that led to that being there. But even if it's an accident, somebody ate it. Somebody made use of it, and maybe that's the opportunity, right? I'm from Alabama. I know people that eat roadkill. That's no sin. It's absolutely true. No, it's spot on. Very good question. So there's a...
So, a long time ago, before the white people come over here, there was no Indians on welfare. Well, they got over here, and they started wanting the land. We signed treaties to get along with them, to try to help one another out, but their greed got bigger and bigger. Then they sent Andy Jackson down to Alabama and Georgia. And then the first Holocaust happened. He started killing all of our people, running them off in the ocean. And on the way up here from down there was, I don't know how many thousands died along the way. They fed them rotten meat, fed them stuff that you couldn't eat. And then when they got up here, they give them land. 2 meals and 80 acres or something like that. And knowing they couldn't pay taxes on it, they started charging them taxes on it. And then, again, welfare set in real bad. Where are you going to, you can't work, you don't have no way of means of paying for your family, but it happened. Well, since I come along, back when they were called Muskogean and Indian, well, I could get along with that. And then here in the 60s or 70s, they started calling us Native Americans. Well, there wasn't no Americans here till y'all got here. They got here. So, if there's going to be any continuity amongst American people, you're going to have to be some people to come together on these ideas that they got, instead of leaving everybody out and then making their own rules.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think part of it, in terms of terminology, part of a use in anthropology and archaeology. It's an attempt to be more respectful, to use the term Native American. Coming out of the American Indian movement of the 1970s, there was a call for not only greater sensitivity, but for terminological change as well. And I think that it's a quagmire in some senses, because we want to be as respectful, and we want to call you in whatever ways you would choose to be called. The problem becomes when you're with some Kiowa or Osage and they want something different. So that's probably more, we need to be more respectful of that. Just like the discussion that's going on right now in Washington, right? Isn't everybody honored that there's a national football team named in honor of Native people? No, absolutely not. But there are op-ed pieces from Daniel Snyder, the guy that owns the Redskins, and other people supporting that name, who are saying, we're honoring people, we're honoring people. Well, please stop honoring us, is what many Native peoples are saying. It's like, we've had enough honor, you can stop that now. And it's absolutely an indigenous issue. It's something that people, if you're so inclined, need to raise hell about.
I understand your concept and your interpretation of the your talk today, your lecture today. It's interesting that you bring up some of the spiritual aspects of different civilizations and different countries coming into the United States. The Muskogee are, very spiritual people, and one of the things that I just wanted to make comment on was that on some of our sides of our family, of course, or especially my own, are from the Upper Creek and the Abika-Talladega tribal towns. And on the other side, some of our families came from England that were run out by when Cromwell took over as a colony. And so some of the people that came in and, of course, intermarried with the Muskogee were people that were run out of England, that were being killed off by the thousands by the King of England that came over for spiritual reasons. They were embraced here by a spiritual people who understood Creator. So I think that maybe for you to poo-poo some of the things that people came here for, different reasons. They came here for, like you say, commerce, but they came here because they found a people that were generous and giving and embraced them. So I just wanted to make that comment.
I appreciate it. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's an issue there, because was it the king or was it Cromwell that was persecuting your ancestors? Because those are two different people. Right, they fought against each other. So it depends on whether it's Protestant or Catholic. So there's some complexity there, but you're absolutely right. The acceptance, come as you are. And again, I think part of it is in an hour-long talk, these are things that people write 600-page books on or dissertations. What I was trying to be is intentionally provocative, and I'm sorry if I pushed the metaphor too far, but we've been told over and over and over again how virtuous these pilgrims are, that they came here for these religious freedom ideas, but a great number of them, that comes later, right? The first, Jamestown and other places, were purely commercial enterprises. It's about making money. So if I painted a brush that said that's why everybody came here, that's probably pushing it too far, I agree.
Earlier you had mentioned something about the Holocaust. This is something that, you heard a lot of our people talk about, at different times, and, you hear about the Jewish Holocaust pretty heavily. And what I've often wondered is why, the educational institutions, as much as they know about all this, and, we could probably come out and say something as a tribe, but yet not really be heard, but if it would come from the educational community, it might be a difference. Because I know, again, we talk about this sometimes and how it was actually much greater than what took place overseas. But yet, none of those things are ever really pushed out there. And I think, understanding that, I think that would begin to help other people to actually begin to take a bigger look at, the tribes and stuff, and see the bigger significance of what, the parts that we played within, how everything is around even today. but because we don't always accept those things in this society, again, I don't know that it's going to happen, but how come you guys, I often wondered why you don't do that.
Yeah, I think part of it is it's a two-way street. One of the things that I would say is Kansas and other places are great examples of most school issues, particularly K through 12, are local issues. Run for the school board, because the school board is the one that sets the curriculum within the boundaries that the state Board of Education sets. Create units. Well, we've done units at 2 universities where I've been in the past that are summer teach-ins where K through 12 teachers can get continuing education credits to come and learn these parts of the history that they can then take back and educate students at an earlier period. It's taught on college campuses across the country. I think the problem is the greater penetration and the understanding and the knowledge. Part of it, again, this is just sort of my skewed perspective as one bald Stalin or Lenin-looking white guy, is most people don't want to rake their ancestors, right? Most people don't want to stand in the mirror and say, running through my veins is the genetic material of people who did horrific things to other people. That's something that once you acknowledge that, what do you do with that? How does that sort of change how you then live that message? And I think maybe we look at contemporary German society, like the generation my age that had nothing at all to do with World War II but came in its aftermath. How have they had to sort of collectively heal and approach that and start a dialogue that acknowledges it and tries to build connections and community? Maybe it starts today. Maybe it starts in here. Maybe it's an opportunity that you bring me an idea, we work together, we draw everybody else in, and we start a nationwide campaign that does exactly that. Mm-hmm.
I have one last question, and then we're going to go ahead and cut this off.
I'll just say one thing to that. I'm sure most of you know John Beaver, who works for the Muskogee Creek Nation Museum Department. John was one of my graduate students and one of my undergraduate students when I taught at OU. We've been friends and colleagues for more than 20 years now. And I can remember when we moved to Chicago, because John followed me there for grad school, he introduced himself as Muskogee Creek, and the first thing that some person, and I'll leave the expletive out, said was, "Wow, you really speak good English." And it's those stereotypes are deeply entrenched.
Anthony Mechi Sanle, Kalanja Hassan, la Kayasata, Uncle Wade, Lada Intiga, Go Hantane, Go Chatla Go Wade, Wayowa, Uncle Wade, Hate, KM. I'm expressing appreciation for the comments and to all the panelists, speaking a little bit in the Yuchi language and saying, the Creator has given us our different languages. My question is, and it's kind of a broad question, but what I'm struck with, I very much appreciate the comments and the kind of critical perspective that's being presented in your remarks. But at the same time, it seems to me that the academic scholarly discourse is rather foreign from indigenous communities. We have, of course, this whole history of, as you have well pointed out, this kind of self-serving colonial agenda that has been served through much of the academic discourse of the last century and before. But how do we bridge this gap? It seems to me the academic agenda is really very different, is asking different questions, is concerned about a lot of internal discourse that is based on the way the academy works, what it takes to get publications, what it takes to get academic advancement in the institution, is to pursue questions and do scholarship in a way that really is very separate from, I think, most questions that indigenous communities are asking and concerned about. What is, if you have a comment, what is the thinking about how to overcome that, how to bridge that, or even maybe not real concrete issues, but even a broad strategy of how to really work with indigenous communities and be able to hear those voices and begin to work together, I would hope, in a more effective way.
So it's a beautiful question, well, very articulately expressed. And what I would have to say is the first thing is for me to shut up and start listening, and for the discipline to shut up and start listening. We've been, as a European archaeologist has commented about American archaeologists and their responses to Indian people, is we've been blinded by our own profession and our own standing, that we're the expert. And I think everybody who's presented, first and foremost, we acknowledge we are not the experts. You are the experts. I mean, we're here to tell you the stories that the archaeology that we've been exposed to has revealed. What I would hope is that true dialogue and communication is, I have certain skills, Professor Foster has certain skills, everybody here has certain skills and interests, but we want to be of service to the community. My lifelong dream, and this sounds very self-serving, but Tom and I have talked about this for 3 or 4 years, is to run a project in eastern Oklahoma, staffed with Creeks who want to know about archaeology, looking at the Trail of Tears. I want to look at, we have a fairly good idea about all of the historical and archaeological events that take place up to 1832, between 1832 and 1836, and the diaspora that brings the Muskogee people here is a story that archaeology has yet to address. And what I am interested in is, we see the scattering of local communities and then eventually allotments, individual allotments in Alabama in 1830s, where people are given 40 acres and the surplus is sold, right? That's a story nobody's ever heard before. But the federal road cuts through, all this disruption of creek lifeways. The Trail of Tears happens, and then archaeologists sort of turn it over to the historians. But there are stories there that the historians don't know that you do. There are sites, and this is information, this is something that I think all of us benefit from. Our discipline benefits from it, and I think that there could be an understanding of what that process was like. What kind of foods were you eating? What kind of animals? There are different native plants and animal species in eastern Oklahoma. It looks a lot like Alabama, but it's not Alabama. What are people eating? How are you having to adapt to that? What happens now that you've got different neighbors who speak different languages than you've never been exposed to before, who are saddled up right next to you? And I think part of it is me saying, I'm interested to do that. And we can write National Science Foundation grants that will pay high school and college students who are on your roll to come and learn these skills, who can then, I would love to train a group, and this is another dream, train a group of Muskogee archaeologists who want to go to England and dig the crap out of England and tell the stories about old white people. I think that would be fantastic, right? Let's do that. But first, let's come and let's cooperate, let's work together. I will come back. Dr. Foster and I are both committed to this idea. We'll come back and say, what is it that you want to know? Let's go do it. Let's find out. Use us. We're here to be used. I've been called a tool before, but now I think I know what that means.
All right, I want to give Mr. Professor Cameron a hand. We're going to do a short drawing here, but like we said yesterday, the purpose of the symposium and bringing all these scholarship with us today is to start that dialogue that we're talking about. We need to talk to our representatives, talk to our government, and say, look, we're interested in this. Because if not, then we're just going to have a symposium after symposium, and we're not going to get anywhere. But if you talk to your representatives and say, look, we're interested in that, we want to start doing this, we've got these ideas, if y'all can help us out do that as a preservation department, we can bring that here for all of us. Like I said, one of our main interests also is to get our young people involved, our students involved, get that idea in their head that they want to know who their people were. So, with your help, we can get that accomplished. So I just wanted to say that. And